Uganda lifts the age limit for its president. Has Parliament created a leader for life? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Yoweri Museveni. Uganda's president once said he despised African leaders who want to overstay their time in power. It sounds strange coming from one of the continent's longest-serving leaders. And now the same man has just signed a bill to remove the age limit on his presidency. It's not the first time Yoweri Museveni has made changes to the constitution to remain in office. Back in 2005, he passed a law allowing him to run for 3 more terms. And now the 73-year-old leader could potentially be president until he dies. It's been a contentious issue in Uganda, even causing a brawl in parliament. So, what will it mean for the country's democracy? Randolph Nogel reports.
It's an issue that has divided not only Ugandan society, but even the ruling party of President Yoweri Museveni.
Against was 62, in favor 315.
The man who stood to benefit wasn't there to celebrate his victory, but his supporters were. A scene of relative calm compared with the months leading up to the vote, in which MPs brawled within the halls of Parliament.
I'm disappointed that our own constitution, which is supposed to be durable, as it is stated in the preamble, has been amended just like that.
This is the second major change to Uganda's constitution, and marks the second time Museveni will be able to stay in power as a result. He's ruled since 1986. He's now 73 years old. Ugandan law stated that a president must be between the ages of 35 and 75 to be fit for office. So when the next presidential election comes along in 2021, Museveni would have been ineligible to run. Now he can. Ugandans themselves have mixed opinions on whether he should be allowed to run for a 6th term as president.
So I don't see any danger in age limit, except one works hard to become a president of Uganda so that he can take more years.
We don't have political future in this country from up to date, because first of all, Museveni is a military dictator. He's the one who's tampering the constitution. Everything's under him. When you look at security, when you look at all the institutions, even the judiciary, even the electoral committee, everywhere, he's under him.
Where are you taking me? Where are you taking me?
But the issue has invariably opened the eyes of many Ugandans. During the course of the No campaign, protesters, including opposition leaders, were arrested. 2 were even targeted in a grenade attack. The argument for staying the course has faltered in other African countries, like Zimbabwe, where longtime President Robert Mugabe was recently deposed. And South Africa's Jacob Zuma could also soon be on his way out. Yoweri Museveni, Africa's 3rd longest-serving president, may be in a position to continue his reign. But it appears growing opposition could encumber his hold on power and tarnish his legacy. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Kampala is Dickens Okello Honeystraw. He's the Ugandan Parliament correspondent for news website Chimp Reports. Also in Kampala, we have Joshua Poro. He's a political analyst and journalist. And from London, we have Charlotte King. She's an Africa analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Dickens, let me begin with you. So we have President Museveni. He's 73 years old. He's had 31 years in power. Why does he need more time?
Well, it's not about him, but also the party and the whole country. Indeed, you have said it, he has been in power for the last 31 years. His party, the ruling party, the National Resistance Movement, still want him around, and there was room for that amendment. He himself, he feels there's still a lot he can offer for the country, and he's not forcing himself, he's doing it through the Constitution.
He's not forcing himself, Joshua, he's doing it through the Constitution, and if we actually look at Parliament, we see that the bill, when it was a bill before it became law, was passed 315 to 62. It's democracy. That's what the lawmakers want. Joshua?
I think it will be a mistake for anybody to imagine that this is democracy. Let me pose a question. Could you imagine that democracy is changing the constitution for the benefit of one man who has been in power for over 30 years? Several years ago, we changed the constitution. We removed the presidential term limit because of the benefit of one man. And now we have changed the constitution, removing the term limits that we earlier removed, reinstating the term limits that we earlier removed, and now removing the age limit, still for the benefit of the same man. I don't think I would want to call this this democracy. The constitution anywhere in the world can be changed at any point. But leaders who are responsible and legitimate choose to respect the Constitution. Why can't ours respect the same Constitution, respect the term limits that were there, respect the age limit that was there at the time? I don't think this is democracy. I think our democracy is being stifled for the selfish interests of one man.
Charlotte, this one man in the past said he despised African leaders who want to overstay their welcome in power, but he wants to stick around. Now, what can we make of that?
I think there's strength in both of the arguments that we've heard here. Yes, on the one hand, he does still carry a degree of personal popularity, both within Parliament, within the party, but also within rural areas as well, among Ugandans. But for international businesses and for us looking at it from a political risk perspective, there's a huge amount of risk surrounding this idea of very personalised rule. Because frankly, he, A, can't live forever. So at some stage, there is going to have to be a succession process in Uganda. And to an extent, the longer that's put off, the riskier it becomes and the more difficult it becomes. And there's also increasingly a huge degree of risk surrounding the patronage politics that underpins Museveni's rule. Yes, he does carry a degree of popularity, but he also shores up his support by leaning very heavily on the police and the security services, and also by leaning on handouts, and he buys a lot of this support that we see. So, as I say, I think there's strength in both arguments, but ultimately it's a risky way to go about ensuring political stability.
So, Dickens, your country has one of the youngest populations in the world. You yourself, you are a young man, from what I can see. You support the president and you support removing the age limit. A lot of other young people do not. They protested in September. A lot of them were beaten up. They faced tear gas. A lot of them were arrested. Do you accept that a lot of other young Ugandans don't want this because they want somebody who represents them more, who represents the vibrant youth more?
Well, clearly, as you have stated it, indeed, I'm a young man. I'm 28 now. There's one thing we are forgetting. This law is not all about one man, as you guys have started it, that it's from 70. Anybody else who is above 75 come at the year of election in 2023 he or she can easily stand. It is not that. There's no connotation that it's only there for President Museveni.
So are you excited about
young people?
Are you excited about the fact?
To get to leadership?
Certainly.
Yeah,
are you
that's very true.
Okay, so besides him, so that will be 2021, where he would be running for a 6th term into his late 70s. So besides him, you're telling me honestly, you're excited about the fact that there might be other candidates who are 75, 76, 77, 78 years old. That's what you want for your democracy.
Well, in the United States, Donald Trump is above 70. Is above 70. In Zimbabwe, the world has just celebrated a man of 75 taking over from Zimbabwe. Uganda is not an island. Uganda is also is a country among those in the world. And anybody from 35 is free to stand against President Museveni. It's not that it's going to be there automatic.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you say Zimbabwe.
There's going to be elections.
Certainly, it's interesting you say Zimbabwe because
whoever is willing.
Okay, fair enough. But some people make the comparison not with Mnangagwa, the man you're talking about, but they make the comparison with Mugabe. They're saying Museveni is becoming Mugabe. They're not celebrating the fact that Museveni is being like Mnangagwa, right? What do you make of the argument that Yoweri Museveni is becoming more and more like Robert Mugabe?
Well, the situation of Zimbabwe, you can't compare with Uganda. First of all, the economic policies that were put in by Mugabe is quite different from here. Charles just stated that in the international perspective, looking at it economic-wise, there is a risk. And I even don't see it. For the last 31 years that Museveni has been in power, economy has been growing at an average 6.3%. Charlotte knows that very well. And I'm not seeing any risk of our economy collapsing tomorrow because Museveni is still there remaining in power, or there's someone else who is like 90 years who is coming to rule Uganda. Okay. Economy is still perfect. Okay. They mentioned about the police. They mentioned about the court being used. security was only used when rioters went to the streets. There were others wanted to ban. So the responsibility of the security is to detect and avert crime. Security did its work. There was boxing in parliament. We all know that. And cases went to court. Nobody was shot or killed extrajudicially.
Okay.
They followed the law.
Okay, so let me take your economic point and pose it to Joshua. Joshua, you might not like the fact that President Museveni is going to stick around for a longer time to come, but as Dickens said, he's grown the economy and he's been the stability candidate for more than 3 decades. Isn't that a fair argument?
In 1986, when President Museveni took over power, our currency was stronger than it is now. During the Obote regime, $1 US was equivalent to 3 Ugandan shillings. But now $1 US is equivalent to 3,600 Ugandan shillings. Dickens alleges that notes that our economy is growing at a rate of 6.3%. In 2011, President Museveni did promise that by the end of 2017, Uganda is going to be in the middle-income economy. We are not even anywhere close to that. All we have is a lot of money being put into circulation, increasing the levels of inflation. World fuel prices are going low. Uganda fuel prices can only go high. Prices of commodities can only go high. Inflation might have been controlled just a little bit, but that does not mean that the standard of living of the ordinary Ugandan has been increased. Money for consultation on this very issue was given to members of parliament, 25 million shillings for each member of parliament. Some of them returned and some detained, but I can say more than 350 did remain with 25 million. Now, just imagine all this money going into circulation. There's going to be a by-election. There's going to be a ruling member of parliament going in for this by-election. Lots of money is going to be thrown into the economy. Eventually, we cannot grow. Our money value cannot grow. We can only continue to lose value. So I don't think that our economy growing at a rate of 6.3% is at any point going to help to make the Ugandan economy stable. But also it's very, very important to note that it is not because this man is 73 years. It's because this man has started to believe that he is the only one with the most brilliant ideas to take Uganda forward. It's been 31 years. I myself have interviewed him before, and I asked him the question, you have been in power for 31 years. Now, what new thing are you going to bring for Uganda in the next 5 years? That was during his last campaign. And then he moves forward to not. And as usual, him and his aging cabinet and aging presidential advisors whom I see have completely no role in our economy start to tell stories of how they fought in the Bush War. If you compare the Bush War between then and now, do you see a big difference? My question, have you seen Rwanda? Rwanda just started yesterday, and they're way past Uganda. They're going at 180 miles per hour. Okay. We are doing 20 miles an hour.
Okay, so you're not happy when you compare it to a country like Rwanda, which has its own criticisms with regards Paul Kagame and his leadership and him wanting to stay on forever and ever, it seems, but maybe they're doing better economically. Let me ask you, Dickens, about the Catholic Church, because there was a New Year's message from the Archbishop of Kampala, Cyprian Kizito Lwanga. He rallied some citizens to resist the, quote, bad politics under Yoweri Museveni's rule. He also claimed the president was dishonest. When you have the church wading in and saying these sorts of things, doesn't it tell you that something's bubbling under the surface and that there might be some issues here with the fact that the president wants to stick around for a long, long time and that the age limit is gone?
Well, the church has a very big following, and a bishop coming out to say that indeed can send a strong message. But also, according to the Ugandan constitution, church leaders, just like traditional leaders, they're supposed to be non-partisan. But of course, in case of anything, they can come out. Nobody is saying they shouldn't come out. To me, the Archbishop had the right opportunity to air. He had the right way to air out what he wanted, but telling his members, telling the church members that the changing of the constitution is illegal is something that I didn't expect. Even the Catholic Church itself, since the 17th century, there have been a lot of changes. They have made amendments. What they are saying is the moral question, not the legal part of it. Legally, there was nothing wrong. Now, who has the moral yardstick? How about the changes in the changes in the Catholic Church? What has he ever said about it? There was nothing wrong with this changing of the constitution. Him coming out to say that, to me, he's taking a partisan side, which he's not supposed to do.
Right.
In the actual sense, he's not supposed to take a side.
Okay.
He's only supposed to state the merits and the demerits without condemning.
Okay.
In this case, he condemned the state.
And let me build on that and go to Charlotte. So when you start to see these fractures, we've seen it elsewhere on the continent. We saw it in a place like Burundi, when Pierre Nkurunziza decided to stay on. When you talk about risk, is this what you're talking about? The fact that one man wants to stay on, his supporters want to keep his power entrenched, and the country is restive as a result of it. Is that the risk you're talking about?
Absolutely, and I think the comments by the Catholic Church were actually fairly significant, because what they do is demonstrate and prove that the pressure on Museveni isn't just coming from the disenfranchised youth that might take to the streets, because ultimately those are fairly easy to repress if you've got a strong enough security services. But the comments by the Catholic Church show that there's also pressure among the elite as well, among the elder generation, but among the more senior figures in civil society, in religious organisations, in the political elite, in universities. The pressure on Museveni from this cohort of people could perhaps be much harder to defend against. So when we monitor the risk, we of course look across the continent. So yes, we might draw similarities on some instances with somewhere like Zimbabwe, where that revolt came largely from within the elite. Yes, there was political pressure from the bottom, and yes, there were protests. But ultimately, the change of regime there was fueled by internal dynamics within the regime. And I think something that we'll be looking very closely at over the next few years, and certainly in the run-up to 2021, is how the other senior cadres within the NRM respond to this very evident policy now that Museveni plans on staying around for a very long time.
And Joshua, when people tell you, whatever you might think of the man or the ruling party, the president was democratically elected 5 times. So suck it up.
I think that at this point, our definition of democracy is most likely to change. During the last election, the results that were declared were actually for just 30% of the country. The rest of the 70%, the results had not yet arrived at the tallying center before the results were declared. So why would one love to imagine that 30% of the votes would account for the 70%? At least I would support a 70% accounting for 30%. In addition to that, members of the opposition and independent candidates who were at the National Tallying Center, who were validating the votes, making sure that the right numbers have come, we are not allowed to have phones. All they had was a computer monitor in front of them to see how many votes were counted in which constituency or in which district or from which polling station. But they were not even allowed to have communicating devices to communicate to their counterparts back down in the field so that they can have the correct figures of how many were counted down and how many have arrived there. So I don't think that is a democratic process. Besides that, I want to just touch a little bit on the issue of the church. The church has a responsibility to its flock. You see, you cannot expect an archbishop, a pastor, or a reverend to ignore the fact that there is a problem with our society and not use a platform like the pulpit to talk to members of society who come to that church. Much as they simply play a ceremonial role and not an active or partisan role, I think they have a primary responsibility in advising and guiding members of the flock and members of the community spiritually, because these are the voters, these are the electorate, these are the people who make the choices, and these are the ordinary Ugandans who need to hear the truth about what is going on.
Dickens, Okello, Hanistro, I'm going to give you the final word here. We've seen a few questions being hung on the notion of democracy in your country. Especially Joshua, he questions whether Museveni was actually properly, really democratically elected, especially in the last election. Tell me what you have to say to that.
Well, in the last election, the turnout was 57%. There's no any other country in the world where the turnout has ever been 100%. It has never happened. Even even if in Korea they are to vote tomorrow, you'll never get that 100%. Now, in this 57%, Museveni indeed got above 50% plus 1 vote. And those who disagreed with him, they went to court, and the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, decided that his win was legitimate. There was nothing illegitimate with his win. Well, he has been there. He has been elected 5 times, and all these 5 times, all the political parties participate in the election. There's no any candidate who has ever been locked up. Like he has just mentioned a neighboring country where a lady was she wasn't put even in the ballot, and she was locked, and she's still in prison right now. You can't compare that to Uganda, really. In Uganda, nobody has ever been incarcerated because he or she has shown interest to stand against Museveni. And nobody has ever been stopped by Electoral Commission to be nominated to stand for election against Museveni. It has never happened, and I don't see it happening. In Uganda, we have the breed of democracy we have is a matured one. Nobody can come and stop anyone from talking whatever he or she wants. You can express yourself freely and at any time, and nobody's going to arrest you. There is court. In case of anything, there's not going to be firing squad. They take you to court, and they follow all the judicial procedure.
Okay. There's no firing squad. I mean, that is encouraging.
What happened at,
some would say that's a low bar. But unfortunately, I've got to wrap now. The man is 73 years old. He's been in power for more than 3 decades. He's still healthy. Is this healthy for democracy, removing the age limit? We'll be watching Uganda closely to find out. But for the moment, I've got to thank you all, Dickens, Okello, Honeystraw, Joshua Porro, and Charlotte King. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, California legalizes recreational marijuana. A cause for celebration or a huge risk to public safety? And Egypt debates a proposal to ban atheism. Should not believing in God be a crime? While many celebrated the new year with champagne, some ushered it in by getting high. And now in California, that's totally legal. The state has become the 9th and largest in the U.S. to legalize marijuana for recreational use. The new law comes 20 years after the state first allowed the use of the drug for medicinal purposes. For cannabis advocates, the decision is an important step forward in alleviating the stigma around the drug. But critics are concerned it'll lead to huge public health and safety costs. We'll debate that in a moment, but first, here's this report from Basil Rehan.
New Year's Day in California, the Golden State. The nickname recalls the days of the gold rush. Today, however, many see the beginning of a new rush, and it looks distinctly green.
This is what it's all about. I mean, this is the first day of legal recreational sales in the city of West Hollywood. There's a line of about 150 people outside.
Recreational marijuana use is now legal. Adults 21 and older can now grow up to 6 plants and possess as much as 28 grams of the drug. But finding a place to buy it will be tricky at first. Most retailers are so far concentrated in just a handful of areas. 2 of the state's biggest centers, Los Angeles and San Francisco, are both behind with issuing permits to retailers, so there's no buying weed there for now either. Meanwhile, a few communities have adopted laws forbidding recreational marijuana use. Critics of legalization say California is opening its doors to a gateway drug. That's a popular catchphrase for a theory that the use of one psychoactive drug inevitably leads to another. That theory, however, has been debunked by many. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control says 7,000 Americans are lighting up for the first time every day. An overwhelming majority of them never go on to try another illicit drug. But the CDC is concerned about the lasting effects marijuana use has on teens' health and well-being, saying it can contribute to mental illnesses including depression, anxiety, and psychosis. Meanwhile, local law enforcement in California is worried about a potential rise in impaired driving, as well as the cost of enforcing the new rules. Proponents of legal weed say the solution to everything is more regulation. For now, an increasing number of Americans seem to agree. A recent Gallup poll found that 64% of Americans are in favor of legalization. Local officials are listening. Recreational pot is now legal in 8 U.S. states, plus the District of Columbia. For medicinal marijuana, it's 29.
I, as you know, am dubious about marijuana. If states, can pass whatever laws they choose, but I'm not sure we're going to be a better, healthier nation.
There's deep disagreement between federal lawmakers and a growing number of U.S. states when it comes to marijuana policy. For decades, Washington has spent billions of dollars in an effort to destroy the global drug trade.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
The scope of the effort includes marijuana, which the federal government classifies as a controlled substance, like heroin or cocaine. In recent years, an increasing number of countries have begun softening their stance on pot. At least a dozen European countries have decriminalized it. In 2015, Jamaica also decriminalized it. South Africa is reviewing its pot laws. And across Latin America, there's increasing pressure to legalize weed.
Who wants a nug?
Uruguay and Canada are currently the only two countries to fully legalize the drug. So is Washington being left behind? For many U.S. states, a big draw to legal pot is cash. Lots and lots of cash. California's entrance to the legal weed market, with its 40 million strong population and an economy ranking in the world's top 6, is driving renewed excitement. Pot stocks are smoking and weed businesses are getting a major kick. Since Colorado began allowing retail weed sales in 2014, it has collected more than $500 million in tax revenue and related fees. Other states are now hoping to replicate the same financial success. But critics say the cannabis industry is moving too fast, too soon, without enough consideration for potential consequences. Many will be watching to see if legal weed brings problems or prosperity. Basil Rahan, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to California now. And joining me from Sacramento is Roger Morgan. He's the chairman of the Coalition for a Drug-Free California and the founder of the anti-drug Take Back America campaign. And from London, he's Peter Reynolds. He's the president of Clear Cannabis Law Reform, a UK group working to end the prohibition of marijuana. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Roger, let me begin with you. California made this decision. It's legalized marijuana for recreational use. Tell me why you have a problem with that.
I know a lot about marijuana. My reason for involvement is I have 2 stepchildren that got addicted to marijuana and other drugs at age 12 and 14. And having observed the mass devastation of 2 otherwise beautiful young children and seeing what it could do to many more, I've been engaged in it for about 20 years. I probably studied the research more than most people on Earth. I don't pretend to be an expert, but I'm kind of an expert on the experts. This drug was dangerous 50 years ago when the potency was only 1/2 to 2%. Today in California, what they're selling as medicine ranges from about 25% in smoke form to as high as 98% as wax or oils used in dabbing and vaping. The impact on human beings is extraordinary, particularly anyone under 25 or 30 years old, because their brains aren't fully developed. And what we know about marijuana's impact on the brain is that it causes physical and chemical changes to the brain for those in that category that are permanent. It causes loss of intellect by up to 8 points in one's IQ.
Okay.
And mental illness and addiction. Okay.
And certainly, so you're not a fan of marijuana and you believe it's harmful. Peter, what's interesting is that Roger didn't go on and say this is a gateway drug, it's a slippery slope to cocaine and heroin and so on. He didn't like or doesn't like marijuana for what it is, not for what it might open the door to. Do you accept any of that argument?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true to say that cannabis is not harmless. And anybody who advocates the idea that cannabis is harmless is really being a bit silly. But by the same token, it's equally silly to describe cannabis as dangerous. You know, you've only got, I mean, obviously, in terms of data, I can only speak for the UK and Europe. But certainly the impact it has on public health is so small as to be irrelevant. Now, that's not to say that there aren't individual tragedies, but there are individual tragedies with many substances and with many life activities, and it's all a question of proportion. I mean, the UK, for instance, with a population of 65 million, I can tell you that there are 1,600 hospital admissions in relation to cannabinoids in the past year. But in fact, there's been 3,000 hospital admissions in relation to peanut allergy. And I think that puts the thing in proper context.
Okay, so let's park off peanuts. Okay, fair enough.
It's not done.
Certainly, Peter. Let's park off peanuts for a moment. Let me ask Roger about something like alcohol, perhaps, right? It's legal, but there are rules and restrictions. It's regulated. You don't want to drink and drive. You don't want to smoke weed and drive, maybe. Why can't marijuana be exactly the same? Legal, but regulated and controlled by society, by consensus.
It's impossible to control it. Number one, there's a difference chemically between alcohol, which consists of one chemical, and marijuana, which consists of about 500 chemicals and 100 cannabinoids. The definition of well, we won't talk about medicine at this point, but just comparing it to alcohol, you can have a couple of glasses of wine a night and not have a problem. Literally everybody that consumes cannabis, whether they think it's medicinal or they're doing it for recreational purposes, basically 1/2 of the THC stays in the body and the brain for a month, and it compounds with each additional use. So what we're doing is causing mental impairment. I don't agree that that this is a minimal health problem. We have over 500,000 ER visits in the United States owing to marijuana. We've got psychotic breaks where people are creating mass murder, suicides, mental illness, addiction. All of that leads to more crime, more homelessness, more public cost.
Okay.
The cost for alcohol and tobacco are 10 times more than the revenues gained from taxation.
Okay, so let me get Peter to respond to the medical statistics and anecdotes that Roger had mentioned. Respond to that briefly before I ask you a broader political question. Peter, go ahead first and address the medicine aspect.
Well, I think that first of all, what I would say is I try to not overstate my case on this subject, and I think it would be better if everybody was not to overstate their case and not to indulge in hyperbole. I mean, frankly, the things that, with respect, the things that your other guests were saying are ridiculous. You know, cannabis is not a dangerous substance. You can't demonstrate that it's a dangerous substance through any scientific evidence. What you can show is the way that it works on the human body. We've only known this for 30 years, since the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. And it's a simple fact, demonstrated through evidence, that for at least 95% of adults, cannabis is not just benign, but it's beneficial when taken in moderation.
Okay, and certainly. And a lot of people make that argument when they have chronic pain and so on. Peter, let me ask you about the war on drugs, because I know a lot of what you do is because you believe the war on drugs has been a failure and you believe legalization will be a solution to that. Let me then ask you, okay, maybe the war on drugs has been a failure. As we've seen in the United States, under 3 strikes and you're out, for many people, their 3rd felony, and they tend to be poor black men, their 3rd felony, especially in the 90s and the 2000s, happened to be for possession of weed. They end up serving life in jail and so on. People have died, lots of money has been spent. The war on drugs could be a failure, but Peter, does that necessarily mean that the solution is to legalize drugs?
Well, I mean, I think the war on drugs, I mean, failure isn't the word I would choose to use, although it clearly has been a failure because it hasn't achieved its objectives of a drug-free world, which is clearly an impossible, ridiculous idea. But what I would say is that the war on drugs has caused far more harm than drugs ever had or ever could. The harm caused by the war on drugs are social harms. These are the things that lead to social exclusion, they lead to violence, they lead to the entire trade being in the control of criminals, which in turn leads to things, particularly in the UK, leads to things like human trafficking, it leads to street dealing, unregulated, poor quality products where you don't know what you're buying. And certainly the more harmful forms of cannabis become more prevalent, just as in alcohol prohibition. Right. You know, it is a fact that cannabis is more dangerous when it's handled and marketed by criminals than when it's handled and marketed by responsible, regulated organisations.
Okay, you're not a fan of prohibition. Roger, I know you gave the example of the stepchildren, right? You clearly care a lot for the future generations. There are people who make that argument when it comes to legalizing marijuana because they say, you know what, if we legalize this, it will bring in billions of dollars in tax revenues. We'll build schools, we'll build hospitals, we'll build roads, and so on. This thing is legal, it's on the table, and it will uplift our society and make life better for our kids because we've got all this money. We've got a cash bonanza as a result of that. When you hear that argument, how do you feel?
It's preposterous, to be honest. We have a lot of experience in California that indicates you cannot regulate a criminal activity. There's a lot of people that want to make money on this drug and don't care about the harms they inflict on other people. The other problem we have in California is an environmental disaster because in 8 years during the Obama administration, there was no federal enforcement. So we've had people move here from all over the world because they think they can grow and sell marijuana. We've got 50,000 cultivation sites in this state that are unregulated. It's contaminating the water tables. It's destroying wildlife. And it's so bad. Some of the poisons they're using are contaminating water tables that feed 3 or 4 million people. And what they've said is they have licensed cultivators that in theory would play by the rules, but they don't. They don't. They're using poisons that are unimaginable. Okay. So you can't regulate it, even the dispensaries.
Okay. And let me ask you how you feel about the fact that the majority of Californians voted for Prop 64 in 2016. 57% of the vote said yes, that's why we are where we are today. And when we talk about recreational use of marijuana, we've got California, Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, Alaska, Nevada. All these people believe that this is the right way to go. Why do you think they're misguided?
Because they've been lied to for the last 20 years. The truth about marijuana has been either suppressed or maligned. The person behind all of this, for the most part, is George Soros, billionaire. He is the heart and soul of our problem in California and this nation and the world. And for example, he was worth $7 billion before the Obama administration. He's now worth $27 billion. And what's happened in California and all of these states, people simply don't know the truth about this drug.
You think it's a liberal conspiracy?
Our government has been, I think the liberal conspiracy is part of it, but I think we have a fragile democratic system where money has the ability to corrupt politicians and people, and that's exactly what's happened. So whether the Trump administration steps up, there's indication even this morning that they're finally going to step up and enforce federal law, and then all of this could change overnight, and it should change.
Peter,
we can't have a competitive...
Certainly.
No.
Let me go to Peter,
Sure.
and my apologies for interrupting you because we are running out of time. Peter, let me sort of broaden this out a little bit because I know you two men fundamentally disagree on this issue. Peter, let me add more to it. Beyond weed, let's talk cocaine and other drugs as well. There are people like Harvard professor Jeffrey Myron who believe that all those drugs need to be legalized as well. They point to a country such as Portugal that legalized all drugs, and they say the place hasn't descended into a hellhole and a complete dystopia. Peter, do you support the legalization of all drugs as well?
I do. I mean, I think, in fact, it's even more urgent that genuinely dangerous drugs, such as heroin and cocaine, are legalised. But I prefer not to use the word legalised. I prefer to use the word legally regulated. You know, because, I mean, heroin causes massive problems in our society. But it's not so much the heroin, the use of the heroin, it's the addiction to the heroin and the crime that follows from that. And what we should be doing, it'd be far lower cost to society and far better for the people themselves, that if the people who get in trouble with heroin were given prescribed doses of clean pharmaceutical heroin known as diamorphine, which in reducing doses and conditional upon them attending therapy, it would be far better for society. It would virtually, certainly in the UK, something like 70% of all acquisitive crime is related to drug addiction.
Right.
And it could minimise those harms. And you know, this is the intelligent approach. Prohibition doesn't work.
Okay, so let's get
only makes the problem work.
Okay, let's get a final comment then from Roger. Something like, as Peter put it, legally regulated heroin. Does that give you nightmares?
Yes, it does. You can't regulate it. People that are addicted, they don't care. And he said something that's correct. Most crime is committed by people that are addicted to something. In Sacramento, where I live, 59% of people arrested for any crime test positive just for marijuana, 83% for any drug. So we're never going to get rid of drugs. The war on drugs is never going to be perfect. But as we saw under President Reagan, you can reduce it by 50% if you care about the people. As we saw under Obama, it doubled. So we have to fight it. You can't survive as a human race if we dumb down and destroy the brains and bodies of the people that we're supposed to protect.
Roger and Peter, I have to move on, but I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Roger Morgan and Peter Reynolds, thanks again for joining us.
In some instances, people had attacked atheists who went public in the media. When the victim went to the police station, he was treated as a suspect because of his ideas. So I believe the Egyptian context poses a lot of challenges to atheists and irreligious groups.
Now, it used to be the case that promoting atheism in Egypt was a crime, but could simply not believing in God soon put you behind bars? Well, according to Dar al-Ifta, a body set up to represent Islamic legal research, Egypt has the largest number of atheists in the Arab world, and many are not happy about it. That includes Amr Hamrouche, the head of Parliament's Religious Committee. He's now proposed a plan to criminalize atheism, and the idea is backed by Egypt's highest Islamic institution. Well, to help us make sense of all of this, let's speak to Khalid Diab, who's a journalist and the author of the new book, Islam for the Politically Incorrect. Khalid, good to talk to you. Why is this a priority for Egypt's lawmakers?
Well, I mean, it needn't be a priority. It's really something that's an issue of personal freedom, really, and the Egyptian constitution, in theory, protects and states that freedom of belief is absolute. So it's a kind of contradiction against the very foundation of Egyptian legal norms.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There have been some convictions, right, over the years, especially since 2013, for things like contempt of religion, defaming Islam. All of them, you know, rightly or wrongly, related to something that somebody did outwardly, whether it's something they said or blogged about and so on. But now we're talking about something that sounds a bit like thought crime. Are we entering a reality where somebody can just rat out somebody else and accuse them of being an atheist, and that's enough to maybe get somebody thrown in jail?
Well, I mean, the troubling thing about this proposed bill is that it will remove the legal ambiguity currently, which is currently a status quo in Egypt. At the moment in Egypt, there is no, atheism is not outlawed, and in theory, according to Article 64 of the Constitution, freedom of belief is absolute. But there is a back door for allowing, and this is where the grey area comes in, allowing religious thought crimes in you know, the Egyptian law prohibiting the insulting or defaming of the so-called heavenly religions. So through that, so far, that, you know, whether Islamists or the state, they've been able to, on a piecemeal basis, you know, pursue and sometimes persecute individual atheists and non-believers. But this law has been used as much against believers as it has been against non-believers. There was from the 90s, there was a whole series of cases against reformist Muslims and Muslims of alternative ideas and ideologies in which Islamist lawyers tried to get certain leading Egyptian intellectuals, for example, declared apostates. This happened with Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid, for example, and he was actually, because of this Hezbollah law, as it's called, he was the Sharia court declared that he had to be divorced from his wife. So he and his wife fled to Europe, and he spent many years in Europe teaching in universities there. And he was a believing Muslim. He was just a reformist who thought Islam had to be analyzed through historically sound methodology and contextualized according to the age in which it emerged, and not be seen as a timeless faith.
There's something I want to understand. When these fears and these accusations go out, we see atheism is not compartmentalized. There are connections with terrorism. There are connections with mental illness. There are connections made with even homosexuality. They're all kind of thrown in, finessed in, and stirred about, right? They're all kind of interchangeable in many ways. Tell me what's behind that in Egyptian society from the perspective of the state wanting to prosecute this.
Okay, well, yes, there's a state's perspective and there's the society's perspective, or the social perspective. But from the perspective of the state, it's really had a Jekyll and Hyde approach to the whole issue of belief and atheism since the 2011 revolution. The revolution raised public expectations and made, in fact, the public far more tolerant to dissent, to alternative ideas, to alternative ideologies. And actually atheists who had gone underground in recent decades or kept to themselves suddenly began to have a prominent public profile. They started appearing on television talk shows, they started being interviewed, they started blogging, they started demanding rights in the constitution. And this caused the Jekyll and Hyde issue, partly. Like the state on the one hand would say, especially Sisi, who rose on a wave of anti-Muslim Brotherhood rhetoric in which he said, we won't be like the Muslim Brotherhood, we want to reform Islam and make it a more tolerant religion. And then on the other hand, his interior ministry has been arresting atheists on a piecemeal level. Al-Azhar, Sunni Islam's supposedly most prestigious institution, has declared a kind of war on atheism, in which they've even set up kiosks in metro stations and in public places to try and teach supposedly the right version of Islam, because there's this conception that it's because people are turning to atheism because they don't understand Islam properly. Although for atheists like myself, it's because we understand Islam and religion all too well that we've turned away from it.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, that is an interesting double standard, because particularly Sisi is projected as an enlightened leader who replaced, in his opinion, a religiously fanatical Muslim Brotherhood, right? And you don't see much criticism of this from his allies, particularly in the West and so on, when they're rounding up atheists. Let me then move on to the issue of Egyptian society. Now, I'm not asking you to psychoanalyze tens of millions of people, but understanding a little bit about Egyptian society, it's deeply conservative, but then it's also deeply cosmopolitan and eclectic, and there's a live and let live feeling about the Egyptian people. You've got an incredible history in the country. If prosecution and persecution of atheists is a thing, would it have the will of the majority backing it?
Well, that's very difficult to ascertain. I mean, it's quite easy in times of rapid change and fear and paranoia and insecurity to whip up the masses, even in a society that is traditionally one of live and let live. You saw that with the anti-Muslim Brotherhood campaign and rhetoric following, the ouster of Mohammed Morsi. The Muslim Brotherhood was so demonized in the media, in the pro-military media, or at least in the pro-state, pro-military media, and by the state itself, to such an extent that a lot of Egyptians were so fearful and distrustful of the Muslim Brotherhood that they condoned and even cheered as Muslim Brotherhood, unarmed Muslim Brotherhood members were massacred on a public square. So, it depends on how the propaganda machine works against atheists. If an effective propaganda machine whips up public fear and anxiety towards atheists, and already, some people are trying to do that, that atheists don't have a moral compass, which is nonsense. You don't need to believe in God and be afraid of eternal punishment in order to be a good person. On the contrary, some people who are who are declared believers and pious men and women are not that, and Egyptians discovered that with the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood. They thought, oh yeah, pious men will rule the country well and have their hearts on the people, but that was not the case. Also, there's whole there's attempts to link, but by people who are counter-atheists or want to be populists, and whip up, public fear and support. They condemn atheists as Satanists. There was a cafe that was supposedly a den of atheism. It was called the Atheist Cafe, that was shut down by the police last year. And, the officer in charge claimed that they had satanic symbols hung up on the walls. And the place didn't advertise itself as an atheist cafe, but they had satanic symbols, which is complete, I don't know, gobbledygook. How many atheists are Satanists? I mean, it's this idea that if you're not, if you don't believe in God, it's very unlikely that you believe in the devil as well, which is a bit of a contradiction. Yeah, I get you. Okay, Khalid. Unfortunately, I've got to move on, but it's been a pleasure talking to you, Khalid Diab. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Gata. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.